Welcome to our workshop on Has the Sleeping Dragon Woken Up? And over the last 24 hours, the answer may be yes. This is a sold-out event on U.S. tech competition and collaboration. Thanks to K&L Gates, Chris Cho, and Matt Mangan for this beautiful space and keeping us warm from all the rain outside. This has been a long-term project for our Northern California and Seattle centers. Seattle is also new to us over the past year, so we are expanding on the West Coast. And part of our expansion is the addition of Mark Cohen, our Senior Tech Fellow, to our team. We're really thrilled to have him here. He's the former head of IP at Berkeley Law. He opened the first US Patent and Trademark Office in Beijing, and he's just a national treasure, as we call him internally. Many of you have traveled long and far to be with us, so we appreciate you spending time the day pretty much with us. This is the first time we've done a workshop in this format. Our team is here. We have Christy, Nina, Jason's outside, and Mia is standing there. I'm Margaret Conley, the Executive Director of our centers. Our format today, the first part is recorded and on the record. For our Zoom participants, we encourage you to keep your cameras on. If your camera is on, you will likely be posted on our website video as well. If you do not want that, please turn your cameras off. During the Q&A session for the virtual participants, go ahead and raise your virtual hands. Priority will go to those with their cameras on. In the room, go ahead and raise your hand, and the moderator, Mark, most likely will call on anybody who wants to speak up. We will have a break. We'll say goodbye to our Zoom participants, and then we'll switch over to off the record. The lunch break is before that, and the rest of the afternoon, the last couple hours, are off the record. My role is going to be to keep everybody on time. So I have these time cues here, and with that, I will hand it off to Mark.
Thank you, Margaret. Welcome, everybody. It's at least as important to have great attendees as having great speakers. So I really appreciate all of you being here, either physically or virtually. Our topic is, Has the Sleeping Dragon Woken Up? I'm going to turn to that topic towards the end of this brief intro. We have a great group of speakers in 2 short hours and the lunch. And as Margaret mentioned, the program is recorded and will be made available online. That is the part that is on the record. And then we'll continue over lunch. I echo Margaret's thanks to K&L Gates for hosting us, the great team at the Asia Society, Jason, Evan, Nina, Christy, and of course, Margaret. This topic is critical. One report from MITRE Corporation noted that U.S. competitiveness in science and technology will define American national security and economic prosperity for decades, and that, quote, China's progress is as impressive as it is troubling. Yet at the same time, as Caroline Wagner, one of our first speakers, has noted, too much security could strangle the international collaboration that drives scientific progress. So choosing the right areas to collaborate, to compete with, over what timeframes, what areas, et cetera, is as much a part of this discussion as how to measure what is actually going on. And the focus today is mostly to investigate and discuss optimal approaches for looking at competitiveness and the possibilities for collaboration between the US and China in a range of technologies over different periods of time with different possible data sources, with different actors, government, non-government, et cetera, and different policy considerations. The issues, for example, cover high tech and biotech, which have very different measurements over a short-term horizon or mid to long-term horizon for military or civil applications, to address global challenges such as climate change and pandemics, to determine an abuse of dominance under antitrust or whether government funding should be made available to subsidize a new product or new research, in determining the positive and negative effects of export controls or other trade sanctions, in evaluating science versus applied technology and making smart investment decisions, whether as a government or the private sector, et cetera. We do not expect to cover all these issues, but we do expect to open the dialogue about what best practices might be and how to approach them in an intelligent way. In preparation for this meeting, I asked ChatGPT for an assessment of some leading reports. And it gave me the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission annual report, a RAND Corporation report on scientific and technological flows, ITIF's reports on China, which noted that China is overtaking the U.S. in innovation capacity in a range of fields, and the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence report of 2021. And I'm very grateful that many of the authors of those reports are in the audience, either physically or virtually right now. Caroline Wagner has been a major contributor to those reports, particularly showing how the higher impact of interdisciplinary work in the scientific area with Chinese collaboration. China has also made efforts, and indeed it'd be an interesting study to look at how China approaches competitiveness with the US compared to how the US approaches the issue. There have been a range of reports from Chinese academia on strategic competition, on different potential impacts of technology competition, looking at areas like semiconductors, AI, biotechnology, and the like. Evaluations of Made in China 2025, a new generation AI development plan, et cetera, which often have taken data, in my view, that tends to show China in a positive light, such as its control over supply chains and semiconductors, as a sign of technological competitiveness, something that we might view as a potential weakness on our side, but also looking at patent data and talent flows, new technologies like quantum, CRISPR technology, et cetera, and how China is entering into those domains and becoming increasingly dominant. Perhaps the US and Chinese sides have more in common than differences, but it's interesting to review them. My last point is about our title, and my French is so terrible, but it was attributed to Napoleon, "Let China sleep, for when she awakes, the world will tremble." In all likelihood, Napoleon never uttered these words that legend now attributes to him. Nonetheless, Lenin used the expression in 1923, and the 2018 film Crazy Rich Asians begins with the quote, falsely attributed to Napoleon Bonaparte. And even Xi Jinping, in a speech in 2014, said China is a sleeping lion. When it wakes, the world will tremble. And he said that in Paris. So we have a good place to begin to sort out myth from fact, actual history from recreated history, and apprehension from competition, the risks of disengagement from collaboration, and how to use data the best way possible. So I think the title actually serves more than its apparent purpose. That was my little trick anyway. So to begin with, I have three people on my panel, how to use scientific and technical data. Each speaker will talk for about 12 minutes, and the balance, and I hope there is a balance, will be for Q&A. I also have something I could present, but I'm happy to defer that either to lunch or otherwise. And our first speaker, I'm delighted to have here virtually, is Dr. Caroline Wagner. She conducts research in the field of science and technology with relationship to policy, society, and innovation, with a particular focus on international collaboration. She's on the faculty of Ohio State, the John Glenn College of Public Affairs, and as an advisor to the Battelle Center for Science and Tech Policy. And prior to joining Ohio State, she had a distinguished career at RAND in U.S. missions overseas on the Hill, and she's a distinguished fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and an elected member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And I was privileged to speak with Caroline about a month and a half ago with Dennis Simon, who's also online, on the related topic of US-China science and technology collaboration and the USSTA with China. So, Caroline, the big question, and you can take this wherever you want to, is US-China collaboration with China on science and technology a vulnerability, as some would say, or a strength? Is it something that can be managed to the benefit of the world and the US and hopefully even China as well? I look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you so much to the organizers of this important meeting. I do love your introduction about the sleeping dragon. Come across the quote many times. I think now we have to ask ourselves, is it Barney, the lovable children's dinosaur dragon, or Smog, the dangerous dragon of J.R.R. Tolkien? So maybe that's one of the things we can get around to today. My research has been about how and where China is enhancing its science and technology system, both from a policy perspective as well as from a practical perspective, in terms of studying their publications, citations, collaborations, who they're working with, where are the collaborations going, and connecting around the world. I would suggest that one way to think about this as we start is to look at a longer history than just, let's say, the last 10 years, and to think about this as perhaps a 40-year bubble of international collaboration that has grown and grown and grown over the last 4 decades. Really beginning around 1980, supercharged around 1989 when the USSR broke up and many countries began to join a global system where people began collaborating with one another in much more robust collaborations and connections. And of course, there are many, many contributing factors to that bubble that has grown around international collaboration. The increasing use of English in science, the ease of transportation, the ease of communication, and so on. All these things contributed, but they didn't cause the rise in collaboration. But China, perhaps more than any country, has benefited from this bubble as it has grown, and they've joined pretty much right at the beginning, right around 1980, when I document the just really spectacular rise of international collaboration in science and technology. So China has, of course, partly done that through imitation, but they've also put in place policies to support the development of a national science and technology system. Then, in addition, they've built up their education system and grown their engagement globally and sent, of course, we know, sent thousands of people, mostly to the United States, but also to Europe, of course, and other places around the world to begin those collaborations that have led to so much strength even within the Chinese system. So let me just show you some numbers. That's really where my expertise comes in. I will be show you some numbers here, and this comes out of my own research. My own research, and it is all published in some place in my work. So one of the things that demonstrates kind of the nature of the bubble that has grown up around international collaboration is the fact that if you look at the USA on the left, the EU on the right, and then China in the middle, you see that at least for the USA and the EU, which were much more developed science systems in 2000, all the growth has been at the international level. The line underneath, the rising line for the US or the rising line for the EU, all of the growth of has been at the international level. You can see it nationally pretty flat. China shows a very different pattern. Their international and national growth is in tandem. And so what we see is that China has been kind of born global in a sense in their science system. The US has grown more and more international, still not as international as most other places because of the size of the United States. If you look at like a Switzerland or a Netherlands, they're like 80 to 90% internationally collaborative, right? Because they're so small and they're working at such a high level of science. But US is still pretty low in terms of the overall numbers. But you can see here a really definite trend. But one of the things we've seen here is the blue line, the blue column is China's scholarly output since 2010. And you can see before 2010, really before 2000, it would have been sort of de minimis numbers, but it has grown. And now if you look at some of the scholarly databases that track science, like the Web of Science or Scopus, are two of the most reputed databases. China outperforms even the United States. In 2022, China, the number of scholarly outputs from China bested the United States. That's the first time the United States has been knocked off the top place since 1948, when we took the top place from the United Kingdom. So I think you can see it's really significant change in the scholarly output. And the output usually in Scopus or Web of Science is highly curated, called curated, meaning it's not just junk science. It's not things that are copied or plagiarized. So But the most interesting to me right now is the orange line. You can see that China's international engagement, that is the percentage of international articles in the Scopus database representing China's collaboration with other countries. China and its international engagement peaked in 2018 and has been dropping since then. And we know numbers of things happened around 2018, including the China initiative in the United States, but also a significant policy change in China to encourage people to build national capability. And that is what we see. So this just shows you the top 20 scientific producers around the world, 2022. And here you can see the columns are nations. On the left, China is the top producer, followed by USA, UK, India, Germany, and so on. And again, the orange line is the percentage of international collaborations represented by their work. And you can see, as I said, the smaller scientifically advanced countries are very, very internationally engaged. China's less engaged as a percentage share of all of their work. What you see is around, as I mentioned, 2022, very important year for changes. We can see that the red line is China. Now the starting year is 1995. And you can see at some times exponential growth of China's joining the global science system. And then the percentage of China's work that was international, in this case, it's a blue line. And then you can see that the drop off after 2020. Now, of course, that's partly the pandemic, but it's not just the pandemic. We see China moving backwards, or let's say backwards, but reducing their international engagement. And this is just China and the United States co-publications. China became the top partner for the United States in 2014. And has been and remains the top partner for the United States in terms of co-publications. So even though there's been a drop off in number, China's still our top collaborator. And then you can see the drop off there from starting around 2019, dropping off 2023. We continue to see a drop off there. As Mark mentioned in the introduction, over and over again, we see a very similar pattern. And this shows you the top 1% most highly cited works. These are considered of Nobel class work. These are the works that are like Jennifer Doudna, CRISPR-Cas9 kind of articles. Everyone cites them. They're very famous. What we see, if you look at the top 1%, you see the EU, US, China, and the little blue columns. They are each putting out reasonable amounts. In fact, one of my publications with Lute Leidesdorf and Lin Zhang from China, we found that China had outperformed the United States in top 1% around 2019. What you see, though, on the other lines is that when you put co-publications together, EU, US, China, EU, China, US, and then China, EU, US, what you find is that those works are even more impactful than from any single country. So in other words, the collaborative work gets lots more attention and is considered higher impact work than any of the national works that we see from any one country. And that's true in AI in particular. And it's true of other critical technology areas. So as I mentioned, China's international engagement peaked in 2018. China's top international fields include things like arts and sciences and the humanities, psychology and health, business. So it's not exactly, I think, what people had thought, that China was targeting certain kinds of critical areas. We don't really see that in the numbers. China's patterns show domestic growth for sure. There's a shift from international to domestic research, increasing emphasis on national partnerships, which have increased by more than 5 times. And there's a domestic uptick in things like health, medicine, pharmacy, which make a lot of sense that they would be domestic in a lot of ways, right? Health issues and medicine often tend to be regional and local. And then there's sharp declines in places like psychology, neuroscience, and nursing, but stable patterns in some other areas. So there's different results when you look at the nature of the collaborations. They're shifting somewhat, but much more towards domestic. I don't need to go into this right now. So much of my work presents this, the basics of international collaboration. But the most important thing to know that if you look across all work that's published in the reputable databases, about 30 to 40% of all work is international. And that's part of this bubble that I mentioned growing in probably in 1980. Less than 5% of work was international, and now it accounts for as much as 40% of the databases. And then I know we are interested in patenting. Patenting also has expected patterns that come from studying the nature of patenting. I know a lot of you are familiar with this. Geographic proximity is important, high-tech clusters, university industry transfer is stronger based on proximity. Again, patent citations drop the farther you get from universities. These are well-known facts about patenting in general. But what we see with China is that a third or more of their patents are internationally collaborative, which is really high, actually. And that in China, foreigners account for more than 50% of the invention patents in the years shown. And then about 40% are judged to be kind of quote unquote derivative of other inventions from other countries that are just now being patented in China. And US-China collaborations in patenting are really very high. If you look at, it was about 10% in 2005, but it's much higher by 2022. The applications to the US Patent Office include a high percentage of US-Chinese collaborations in patenting. So I think the main, this is my last slide, but the main story that comes out of my research is that publications follow kind of the expected patterns. You don't see anything really different with China that we wouldn't see with other countries trying to build a science and technology system. In other words, it doesn't seem to be directed. It doesn't seem to be targeted. They are really the expected practices. It doesn't support any kind of military defense or commercial targeting, at least at the large scale that I look at, right, which is big numbers. And people's locations doesn't follow a pattern either. I looked at the mobility of people, Chinese researchers coming to the United States and where they were located, and it much more likely to correlate with the reputation of the institution rather than the nature of the research being done there. So we know, of course, policy has played a role in this on both sides, China and the United States. And I have a number of articles about that if people are interested. Now we know security concerns are having an impact. And I think that is one of the things we wanted to talk about today. And I look forward to the discussion about that as well. And happy to answer any questions about US-China collaboration in science. But thanks again for inviting me to talk.
Fabulous, Caroline. Thank you so much. I think that's a great way to begin the morning. And I certainly have questions, but we're going to hold them until the end of the panel or the end of the 2 hours. So Caroline did open up in a way the next speaker, because our next speaker is going to focus largely on patents. And we're really grateful to Arun Hill coming here to us from the UK. He's the lead consultant at Clarivate's consulting practice and a fellow at the Clarivate Center for IP and Innovation. He holds a postgraduate law degree in innovation law from the University of Edinburgh. And he has a focus on the ethical, where he had a focus on the ethical legal dimensions of emerging technologies. He's the lead author of the Top 100 Global Innovators Report, and he will be providing us with a globalized view of patent strength metrics, key trends and clusters, and very grateful for him to be here, as well as to Clarivate, who often came to programs I hosted at Berkeley, I think over 7 years. So it's nice to see you on this side of the bay, continuing the discussion. Tell us what the patent data shows.
Thank you. And thank you for having us today as well. I feel compelled to say that we might have brought the London weather with us, but please don't hold us against us. So At Clarivate, I'd say our data and our insights, it stretches across the innovation lifecycle. So it does include the kind of corpus of scientific research as well as intellectual property rights. So that's where we kind of get the relationship with the web of science. I guess we are focused on tracking those technology signals at the point of origin, but also that has a downstream consequence in terms of patenting activity as well. So kind of generally speaking, we take a broad view of patents as part of an ecosystem, but it does move beyond this kind of linear idea of technology commercialization towards kind of some more complex dynamics that we see within the data. So I kind of come at this from two perspectives. It's kind of grounded both in the global trends patent data that we see, but also how our own metrics and the way that we track that data has changed over time and how we've had to evolve that within the context of the global landscape as well. So just as a kind of a preface in terms of patents, I think the kind of public perception of patents has certainly evolved over time beyond their kind of pure legal constitution. So today, I think they're much more widely understood as strategic signals. They at first kind of just revealed technical information that would be disclosed in that individual patent, but then at scale, it was an indicator of where companies might be placing bets. And then over time, in terms of the type of work that we are doing, and the research that we do, they're being used through more of a kind of national or regional lens to understand the dynamics of competition. But we do kind of emphasize that it's not a purely volumetric approach. Of course, we have to look at the quality of those patents, and I'll talk a little bit about exactly what those metrics are themselves. I think sometimes patents get a kind of unfair characterization as lagging indicators. That is, of course, kind of partially true, since they reflect the outcomes of research and development that's already taken place. But I also want to kind of highlight maybe a nuance of that particular data set, that they are time-stamped, and that temporal dimension allows us to do certain things with the data itself. So it allows us to track maturity, but it also allows us to identify inflection points in innovation, across different technology areas. So kind of traditional S-curve theory still features quite a lot in the models that we use and how we apply it to patent data. And it's kind of a premise that still holds up, even as we kind of look at, much bigger scale of data that we're ingesting and dealing with. So I just on to the next slide. So I guess you could call this kind of a microcosm of some of the themes that we might see here today. So at Clarivate, one of the tools that we use to assess innovation trends is our Top 100 Global Innovators program. It's now in its 14th year of running. And it's a program that focuses on the strength. It is an awards program, but it focuses on the strength of patents, not just volume, to allow us to compare the activity of organizations across quite a broad, diverse set of industries. So it's designed to be industry agnostic. But what it ends up being kind of the top of the innovation funnel, if you like. But within that, we have much more detailed trends about individual technologies, but also the entity footprint, and I guess the regional footprint that we see within the data. So each invention is evaluated based on 4 different factors. This is just our kind of ethos when it comes to measuring the quality of an invention. So influence is the downstream third-party citations that we have, and it's normalized to a particular industry and technology area. Success, so the number of valid enforceable patent rights that we have, that's weighted to the size of the economy and GDP, but also investment, so the intent or confidence of the applicant in an individual patent. And then finally, rarity, where it sits on the development curve in terms of the mix of different technical features. So it gives us a vantage point to look at trends in the data. So just to kind of pick up on some of those broader themes. So it is definitely exponential. So we'll see more inventions created in the next 4 years than we have in all of history in terms of volume. There's also a lot of convergence across technologies and fragmentation as well. So that top 100 list, we see more and more entities, more and more firms coming from without that list and contributing to kind of global innovation. So China in particular, of course, we've seen an exponential increase in filings, but it's not only volume, it's quality as well. So China now is the leading jurisdiction in terms of what we would call critical inventions. So those are inventions that are filed in more than 2 countries and in the 0.5% of invention strength. However, it's still top heavy, and that's what I'd probably caveat that with is, so within that top 100 list that we produce every single year, it's surprising that there's only 5 or 6 Chinese firms within there, compared to the 20 plus or so that we have from the US, Japan, and Europe. And that kind of suggests that there's quite concentrated activity as well. So specifically within generative AI, we've seen Chinese companies, particularly in the private sector, take quite a leading role in terms of patent filings. Generative AI patent applications from China have increased over 25% in kind of areas like computer vision and natural language processing. But the US tends to lead, and this is just based on our kind of provisional analysis of the data, but tends to lead in more foundational technologies such as the underlying AI models themselves and semiconductor design as well. So there is a slight kind of discrepancy here in that we see a rapid number of Chinese filings, but there's some obstacles as well in terms of access to advanced AI chips and high quality data, mean that many of these patents have not kind of catalyzed in the way that we'd expect, or in a way that's comparable to US technology firms. And sorry, I'll just go on to the next slide. So this is a lot of information to process in one slide, but it helps give a kind of explanation or a explainer of our methodology. So in particular, the 4 parameters that we use in terms of invention strength, so influence, success, investment, and rarity. I think the thing to note is that every year we refresh this analysis, and each idea has to compete head to head in terms of receiving a strength score. And we also set a number of thresholds in terms of the organizations that are included within that list. So a requisite number of published inventions, a number of grants, in order to qualify in the first place. So it kind of provides a bit of reflection on geopolitical strategies. And in the case of China, IP has become extremely important in terms of its industrial planning. So we've seen a kind of restructured IP system. We've seen better enforceability mechanisms through the courts, which I think we're going to address today as well. But also a revision of patent laws and a slightly more kind of permissive attitude, I guess, to software patents and AI applications in general. So to kind of round up or provide a conclusion on that, I still feel as though patents provide a robust kind of metric for technology intent and market positioning. They do speak to the kind of directionality and maturity of technologies, that kind of temporal aspect to patents. The fact that they are time bound is probably an advantage in certain contexts, but it doesn't solve, or it doesn't address maybe some of the deeper kind of doctrinal and policy questions around the patent system that AI in particular, I think, is surfacing. So there is a kind of related issue about how we define AI technologies in the first place. I think it's almost become a kind of platitude that actually is kind of synonymous with generative AI, but it also includes a disparate set of tools and techniques that sit at different levels of maturity on the spectrum. And that's reflected in filings as well. So the picture of patent data might be different from the kind of technological reality of the market. So that's definitely something that we need to take into consideration. We do take the view, so there's obviously a lot of overlap in terms of the type of work that I guess Caroline and our research center undertake as well. So we view the relationship between patents and scientific publications as complementary but complex, I would say. So we do quite regularly combine those data points, and together I think they're kind of equipped to track technology developments and understand some of the broader implications of competition. But the challenge is how we do that. So it's kind of interesting for me in our client work that frequently we're being asked to combine both metrics. It's very rarely that we get asked to look at patent data in isolation. It's often in a policy context that we're having to consider both in terms of volume and quality, and the mapping or co-occurrence of both data sets as well. So there might be some more practical ways that we want to combine those two very different types of data. So it could be co-citation, it could be even mining patent data to understand research topics and vice versa, which I think is a really interesting development as well. But also the overlap in terms of high output research institutions that are producing patents as well. So hopefully that gives a kind of bit of an overview in terms of our kind of philosophy or approach and some of the trends that we see within Chinese data, but happy to take questions.
Great, thank you. We'll hold on the questions until our last speaker. Always the question of overlap between publications and patents. I've always wondered what the impact is of different grace periods. So China is very ungenerous in terms of grace periods. So that would suggest that, you know, patents, getting a patent becomes more important quickly since the scientific paper isn't going to give you, is going to cause you to sacrifice novelty and patentability. But anyway, we can come back to that later. Our last speaker on the panel is Ellie Sakhaee. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Ellie. She leads AI policy for research and innovation at Google, driving responsible innovation in advanced AI systems and emerging technologies. So here we are back in the AI space, and her background spans academic research, public and corporate policy, and AI R&D. She's a real scientist. She's led engineering teams on developing AI algorithms as a PhD in computer engineering, as well as an MBA. So be really interested to see how Google or Ellie combine various data streams, both the ones we've heard about and perhaps other ones, looking at competitive opportunities and challenges. The floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks a lot to the people who organized this event. So I thought that for today's discussion, I would take us to a more broader lens towards the recent developments from China. I want to discuss three main areas. One is that we hear a lot about open versus closed source models, and which one we should actually pursue. The second thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about is that other metrics that we should take into account when comparing AI leadership, and also on other factors that factor in when comparing US and China in terms of AI development. So on open source, I don't think that what we hear is that the West has underestimated the power of open source. I don't think that is a true statement. If you look at Google or DeepMind's portfolio, you see that a lot of models, a lot of the data that actually fed into developing those models are actually open source, open weights available for researchers to build on top of. And a lot of the underlying technology, like the transformers or mixture of experts that these new models from China are based on, are actually developed and released open source from Western countries. In this specific case from Google. So it's very exciting to see that the Chinese firms are actually releasing these models open source. And you have seen how that open source models like Arun and V3 from DeepSeek has invigorated the developers community to actually build on top of already. That being said, I think that other Chinese firms that are also building reasoning models like the recent DeepSeek models have taken a different approach, not releasing the model, rather a technical report. You may have seen this model Kimi from Moonshot AI that was just released last week. This is a multimodal reasoning model that performs on par with OpenAI model and DeepSeek's model, but they decided to not open source it, and they released a technical paper which doesn't go into the details. However, from DeepSeek, we see a lot of activity around it because they laid out the recipe for training models actually very clearly in their research paper, and they accompanied that with the model rates. So I think that emphasizes the domestic competition in among Chinese firms as well. And also, I want to bring our attention to not only AI models, but also the more powerful AI agents. You may have heard about agentic capabilities that enable computers to take actions on behalf of users. And we see a lot of activities around agentic capabilities from Chinese startup firms or collaborating with Chinese academia, releasing open agent foundation models. So we probably will see more and more activities around agentic systems as well, which is a more powerful and action-taking version of the models that have been released. One thing that I think is kind of missed in this conversation, though, is the AI safety part of the conversation. So yes, open source is great. People build on top of a model that is being released. However, if we look at the recent models, they don't add new capabilities, right? So they don't open new powerful models into like the CBRN, like biochemical and nuclear or dangerous capabilities, as we call them. For example, for O1 model, UK AI Safety Institute collaborated with US AI Safety Institute, and they did an evaluation on dangerous capabilities, and they released the report publicly. However, when it comes to open models, there is no control over the safety of the models, because the safety layers and the safety layers built into the model and also around the model can easily be removed. So I don't think that it's a right conversation to have about black and white open source. Is open source better than closed source? I think that we should be looking at this from from a spectrum perspective. It's the spectrum that some models there should be a cautious approach to what models can be open source and what models we still don't know their capabilities, and we should do more research and around their safety before we make them open source or make them available. So again, from I think that the spectrum of open versus closed is very important, and like it's not always the case that okay, great, everything should be open source, or no, everything should be closed, because they may pose AI safety concerns. Another thing that I wanted to bring the audience's attention to is the lack of agreed upon metrics around how we measure leadership, AI leadership. So let me share my screen and share with you this tool that, okay, so on this tool that Stanford High put out, they designed 42 metrics along 8 pillars. You see the pillars here on the left side: R&D, responsible AI, economy, etc., etc. This is a great tool to compare different countries along those dimensions. And one thing that they very cleverly used here was that we give the user the ability to adjust the weights that they want to compare these countries against. For example, here I have set all of the weights for other pillars to 0, and I have only added economy as a metric that we want to compare these countries against, right? So, and then within the economy, I can choose to basically set the other metrics, only look at total AI private investment to compare these countries against each other. That brings us to this question of like, what is the measure that we should be comparing countries in terms of AI competitiveness against, right? So this tool is great, but it also illustrates 2 problems. One is that there's no agreed upon metric, and also what should be these 42 elements that we want to compare countries against for determining their AI vibrancy. So my point is that as a field, we should be thinking a little bit more about what we can factor into these comparisons. And also, as you can see here, you can filter based on years. This means that these are lagging factors. So this actually doesn't take into account the recent developments. So what are the better ways to actually have a tool that accounts for rapid and very agile developments that happen in the AI world? And the last thing that I wanted to mention was other elements. Let me stop sharing. I think that Google has. Okay, perfect. That's good. So the other elements that should be factored in when we are accounting for competitiveness with respect to patents and scholarly publications that my co-panelists talked about are, I want to highlight 3 things. One is AI adoption. So in terms of AI adoption, we can say that China is actually ahead of the US in areas like manufacturing, agriculture, and critical sectors that have adopted AI. So data shows that China has adopted AI use cases in about, they have adopted generative AI cases at a higher rate compared to US, 83% versus 65% in the US. The other element that I think we should factor in is data. From the scaling laws perspective, we know that data contributes a lot to success of AI models, and Chinese firms have access to a lot of data because they are able to collect those kind of data that US firms are not able to. And the other piece is the talent and immigration law effect on how much access these firms have to top AI researchers. So US traditionally has attracted more AI talent, but China produces nearly half of the world's top AI researchers. They have gone from 29% in 2019 to about 47% of AI researchers in 2022. And they have 2,000 undergraduate AI programs already in their universities. So these 3 factors, I think, are also very important contributing elements to how we want to compare competition across different countries. So I pause there. It's a lot to cover, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ellie. There certainly is a lot to cover, and we have about 10 minutes before the next session. So I'd like to give the folks who are here virtually an opportunity to raise questions if they have them, since they won't be with us at lunchtime. If there's anybody out there. Okay, or anybody in person? Otherwise, I'll ask a question or 2. Anybody have some questions to ask? I guess I'm going to go back to Ellie's observations about open source, because when I was in the embassy, in Beijing, and later when I came back to USPTO and I met with Minister Wang Gang from the Ministry of Science and Technology, I asked questions about China's participation in OS projects. So this is broader than AI, so anybody who wants to fill in, please do. And I was concerned that China was a net user of open source projects, but not a net contributor. That they saw an opportunity to leapfrog through open source efforts, but they weren't necessarily putting back. In other words, you know, a Chinese high-tech company might patent something that was derived from open source material, and they wouldn't contribute it back to the open source community. Is open source a potential problem in this area? That is, we're not calculating it, and that we're basically delivering content for free, innovation for free. This was an issue, actually, my first time I met Dave Kapos when he was at IBM, later to become the director of the PTO. I said, well, IBM's approach to open source is just viewed as free of charge by China without any consequent responsibilities. And if it is, you know, how disruptive, as we saw with DeepSeek, it seems to be potentially quite disruptive to expectations about the normal trajectory of technological development. I don't know, Ellie or others of you have thoughts about this. And of course, OS doesn't only apply to high tech. We have OS agricultural projects, for example, and certainly software projects. And I think it evolved out of high tech, and it isn't an IP-free environment. It's actually highly regulated by the individuals that set up the open source community. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I can go first. Maybe Caroline has also comments there. So I want to mention two things. One is that science has always been an open field for everyone to contribute, right? So science has been built on top of open innovation and open science and collaboration around the world. So I don't think that fundamentally we should be thinking about, we should not be releasing our scientific progress or scientific models and data for everyone to use. Like I said, if you look at DeepMind's portfolio, you see that like almost all of scientific breakthroughs that DeepMind has are available for open science and open innovation for everyone to use. On the whether they have been contributors or just consumers, up until now, we have seen a lot of research, for example, in CVPR and other top leading AI conferences, we see a lot of open developments and open innovation from China. The reason that O1 and DeepSeek are so prominent in this field is because O1 is, R1, that is DeepSeek's reasoning model, is prominent because they are the first to create open recipe for how to train reasoning models efficiently, which was not available before R1. So that was the leap that created this very excitement about among developers, because now they have a way to actually develop reasoning models. And it's not, like you mentioned, it's not just about AI. They are also releasing open source, like I said, AI agents and all of the more advanced versions of AI development. So I think that shift has actually happened, that we can't really say that like they're not contributors and they are only consumers. I think pause there. I think James has his hand up.
So that's very helpful. What about, another question is, what about talent? We had a little bit, I think everybody touched briefly on talent. And I know in areas like export controls, you know, you could have a lot of proprietary technology that's in someone's head. It's very hard to regulate that. It hasn't been disclosed in a patent, et cetera. How do we include talent in looking at short, medium, long-term technological competitiveness in a particular field or even a country overall? I think, Caroline, if I recall correctly, you said that something like 47% of the engineers, PhD, world-class engineers, or whatever, in AI are coming out of China. The number has grown dramatically. Does that have immediate short-term consequences, or these newly minted PhDs immediately capable of contributing to the competitive rise of China? Or we're looking at a 5, 10, 20-year horizon? Or, is this going to, are there other factors that will affect the contribution of talent?
Actually, it was Ellie who mentioned the 47%
Okay.
talent. And in fact, anybody who was really surprised by DeepSeek wasn't paying attention. China has been doing tremendous AI research for many years, and DeepSeek itself had been publishing their papers. The one that was so surprising, or the most recent, was just the 12th of a series of papers that were put out. The difference was that they also put out the software as open source, as Ellie very well characterized. But ultimately, talent is everything, right? Because as Ellie so rightly put it, all of science is open, and anyone who has the capacity to understand a scientific article will be able to absorb that knowledge and use it. So if you don't have the talent to absorb the knowledge and make it work for yourself, right, then the knowledge, somebody could hand me a physics textbook and I wouldn't be any smarter about physics than I was before. So because I don't have the capacity to absorb that knowledge. So really what we see is that there's a kind of a sinking strategy, that is, nations and regions make decisions about where to build capacity and capability, and then attract people to that location, right? And that way you kind of sink knowledge in a specific place. And so, as I mentioned in my slides, that proximity is very, very important to technology transfer and knowledge transfer. We can see that over and over again. But in addition, smart places link strategically to places, other places around the world, to tap into, like, what's the best things happening, what are interesting things that are moving ahead. And a lot of times people will travel from place to place in order to see what's happening in a different place. So any strategy around science and technology has to include these two factors of linking and syncing. And you have to make strategic decisions about the syncing, and then you have to make tactical decisions about the linking. And as you do that, right, then you've got to scan the world and look and see, like, where are interesting things happening, and how do we select the ones that are most interesting and helpful to us and bring them back. So, and I think we see this dynamic of the linking and syncing strategy going on all the time. And some of that, of course, is what we call open or open source, and others is just it's tacit knowledge, or it's not yet available because people think they can make some money off of it. So it's a really complex environment, but it's certainly one that we can figure out. And we can also figure out this question of strategy and tactics that would improve the outcomes, let's say, for the United States or for California, should we want to make careful decisions.
Thank you, Caroline. We have a couple of questions in limited time, but I'd like to turn it first to Ambassador Michael Michalek for his question.
Great, thanks. A little bit earlier, I think it was Ellie who said that on AI adoption, that the Chinese seem to be further ahead or more competitive in that field than the United States is. What are some of the use cases in which they've been so successful in doing this, and what are the use cases that seem to be getting popular within the U.S. Development programs?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. I think one of the prominent one is industrial robotics. And we see a lot of adoption in robotics and manufacturing happening in Chinese firms compared to the US. That adoption has not happened at the same rate, has happened, but not at the same rate. So I think one of the prominent use cases that we would call out is robotics and use in manufacturing. We do robotics in a lot of things, like agriculture, a lot of like automating routine tasks. But that has not happened as much in the US.
Yeah, I guess the cargo handling would be one example where they have people are talking about the way in which they've automated ports, and particularly robotic cranes and things like that. I guess that's right. That's right. Now that you mentioned it, I have heard something like that. Thank you.
Okay, and I think since we're at time, I'll take one last question from James Zhang.
Thank you. I want to ask a question to Ellie. That is, the DeepSeek's multi-head latent attention algorithm. Is that the algorithm that really puts its ahead in its innovation, and because of the shorten the KV caching?
That's a great question. Without going into too much technical details, I would say that the thing that put them ahead was a combination of algorithm, hardware, and frameworks co-design. So they very cleverly mixed a lot of small technological advances to make the training stable and scalable. So if you look at their way of handling load balancing in between this mixture of experts, they used a very small trick, but that actually stabilized the way that big models can be trained. So I would say that the innovation that they offer, which hopefully we will see a lot of adoption of that type of innovation in the US, is co-designing software, hardware, and frameworks together. You will see like a long list of small innovations mixed together very cleverly. And kudos to the ingenuity of these Chinese talents to kind of mix and match those very small tricks to make the scalable and stable training for large models. So I wouldn't say I wouldn't characterize one invention, but a lot of these small things mixed together and co-designed together actually led to that.
Can I just join into one point to Ellie's very good comment to answer, also address that question? It's very well known in technological innovation studies that if you create an artificial scarcity, then it actually incentivizes innovation. Like it's kind of like a revenge innovation kind of thing. So think about Linus Torvald, who invented Linux, right? And the reason he invented Linux and made it open source is because he was being denied the underlying software that he wanted to use because it was held as a proprietary software. That's just one example of many examples where if you create an artificial scarcity, you create revenge innovation. And so I think that's one of the places where, as I mentioned, strategy versus tactics, that we have to be very, very careful about where we create artificial scarcity, because I think Ellie so rightly pointed out the cleverness of the workarounds that came out of DeepSeek, which is a great example of this kind of revenge innovation.
Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to end with the cliffhanger of revenge innovation. Maybe Glenn Tiffert will pick up on that, or maybe we'll be exploring other areas. But Glenn, we turn it over to you right now. Thank you all for that wonderful panel.
Can I make a quick comment?
5 seconds.
5 seconds.
Alex.
Yeah.
We need to differentiate open source.
Turn your mic on.
We need to differentiate open source and open weights and open data. I think DeepSeek is not open source. It's open weights, and it's not open data either. So I just want to point out, I think we are kind of like using open source too much here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Glenn.
Thank you, Mark. Really big shoes to fill after panel number one, but fortunately I don't have to do it by myself. I've got a really strong set of panelists here to discuss data. I think you don't understand China is a charge often heard by foreign observers of that country, as if there's a common understanding to be heard of a place so varied and complex, and that failure to grasp that common understanding must be evidence of laziness or prejudice or confusion or maybe some cognitive impairment. I wish it was that simple. One thing I believe, I call it maybe an article of epistemic faith, is that understanding and good policy come from good data and analysis. And particularly at this moment in time, this week, we need both by the boatful. But that's getting more difficult to achieve. Access to data is getting harder because knowledge is power. China is more sensitive to prying eyes, and it's tightening its data regulatory regime as well. Sources are losing fidelity as the politicization and securitization of data corrode its quality and reliability. Some sources are simply going dark, and to my dismay, these ills appear contagious. Finding good data by itself is not enough. One needs the context through which to interpret the data, the capacity to select the right data to answer your question, discern what the data is trying to tell you, understanding how to deal with imperfections, uncertainties, or gaps in that data, and especially to distinguish two superficially similar data points that may actually mean quite different things. This too is getting harder to come by as the number of people with recent deep experience in China thins. I worry that we're training people to treat China as a source of grist for larger theoretical mills, rather than a place with its own temporal, cultural, and spatial specificities, as a place capable of generating its own models, rather than forever being a passive subject of exogenous ones. Let me give a concrete example of why these questions really matter that I think sort of implicitly came up in panel number 1. Recently, both the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and Stanford's HAI have looked at China's AI space and reached dramatically different assessments of China's capabilities in that arena. And so it is possible to look at the same thing and understand it incredibly differently. My panelists understand a lot, and they got there in large measure by aggregating and applying data sources, which is the theme of this panel. In order of appearance, we have Professor Barry Norton from University of California, San Diego, who's going to be talking about China's ambitious planning and technological achievements from text to outcomes. We have Jeff Alstott from RAND online, who will be talking about US government and predictive models for technology. And next to me, Suzanne Harrison from the Haas School of Business at Berkeley, talking about strategic openness. So over to you, Barry, to begin. Thank you.
And I think there are one or two visual aids, right? That hopefully will pop up, but we don't really need them.
Yes.
So great, thank you. My job, I think, is to actually make this a little bit more complicated, which is I feel a little mixed about because it's already pretty complicated. But the basic approach that the basic thing that I want to say is that China's technology and industrial policy is extremely complex, and it's gone through, in particular, let's say, 3 major iterations that has affected very much what China is trying to achieve in research policy and also industrial policy. And that means for us, as we see more and more how important it is to understand what China is doing, what it's accomplishing. I mean, I think it's obvious to everybody, but if it wasn't obvious, DeepSeek certainly made it, especially obvious that China has made tremendous progress in so many different areas. So it's become more and more important that we have some kind of grasp about what China is trying to achieve. Many diverse actors in China who are motivated in different ways, trying to achieve things. We've done a little bit of work with tech, using text as data from China. I'd have to say the stuff I've done is just incredibly primitive in a field that is advancing extraordinarily rapidly. And so I just want to say a few things about where I think there is a research agenda in terms of using text as data, because we're reaching a point where intentions, which in China are often reflected in plans, and policies and outcomes are expressed in text terms that we can begin to study in different ways. And again, the frontier is moving so rapidly, I hesitate almost to say anything about it, but in terms of any specific techniques. But the point is that we can use AI techniques to embed specific terms and specific economic outcomes into a textual space that allows us to figure out the relationship between different ideas, different initiatives, and different outcomes. And I think there are people doing it on patents right now who are possibly making breakthroughs that are both complementary to and reinforce some existing work that's been done on looking at citation networks and things like that. So I just want to quickly embed some of this by a quick perspective on China's, let's call it techno-industrial policy, to cover both science and technology policy and specifically economics-based industrial policy. I think it makes sense to think of this policy as having unfolded in 3 waves or 3 phases over the last 20 years. From about 2006 to about 2015, China stopped just being a reformist, market reformist economy and started to have an industrial policy. And this first industrial policy was about really targeting sectors that China saw as being potential future sources of growth and sources of development. And in that sense, that first phase was kind of like Japan and Korea in the 60s and 70s, similar, rather familiar. But by 2016, when China adopts the innovation-driven development strategy, it becomes something very, very different. In other words, China says, hey, there is a technological revolution going on, and we're going to be on top of it. We're going to master it, and it's going to be one of the paths of our ascent to greatness. Well, that has all kinds of different implications as a policy from the first phase. It's less targeted, more science oriented, in a sense, decoupled from traditional industrial policy. But hey, then in 2020, we see China taking still another phase where perhaps we can think of in response to American tech embargoes, China starts to stress much more the importance of self-reliance, of a domestic system that is capable of withstanding a degree of policies, primarily from the United States, designed to decouple and designed to weaken the connections between China and the rest of the world. So each one of these phases corresponds to a different objective. Each one of these phases uses different instruments. And each one of these phases has different implications in terms of the use of resources and the kind of outcomes that we would expect. Now, one of the things that we've done has been to use very primitive document text analysis tools to look at the science and technology plans that China promulgated in 2011, 2016, and 2021. Can we take a look at the first slide, please? And so we just broke it down into topics, technology. I mean, I'll just cut everything super simple. Is it just space spent on different clusters of topics? And I think the really striking thing is the artificial intelligence cluster, it's the top one there, between 2011 and 2021 moved from 16% to 25% of all of the text spent on technology identifiable topics. So there was this enormous emphasis on artificial intelligence within China's, government steered research priorities. And by contrast, look at the bottom one, the time spent talking about equipment, mining, and chemicals drops from 13% to what is that, 6%, something like that. So we see already in priorities that China was moving really big into AI. Using this same analysis, where were the 2 localities that gave the highest priority to AI? And in other words, they're giving even more than 24% of their total text space to AI. The 2 are Beijing and Zhejiang. So this is as of 2021. Where does DeepSeek come from? It comes from heavy investment in human resources, especially in the province of Zhejiang. Zhejiang University is where most of DeepSeek's top engineers come from. So we can see there's at least some predictive power in this that I think is potentially useful. Now, these different phases and these different actors also mean that there is a kind of oscillation. On the one hand, each one of these policy phases gets layered on top of the other one. So in a way, we can look at China's policy and say, they're trying to do everything. And they are, right? I mean, there is so much government intervention to foster the flow of resources into areas that the government designates as important that it's sort of overwhelming. But therefore, we need, I think, to set up much broader, much bigger, and more systematic effort to use text to understand these things. Now, last point to talk about. The most recent sorry, let me step half a step back for a second and say, because so many of these government actions are devoted to a set of, let's call them techno-economic objectives, we also need to focus on the way that the technologies interact with the economic outcomes. And I just want to mention two briefly. The first is that, especially since 2020, China's been making a very serious effort to reduce its dependence on imported inputs. And if we look at the next slide, we'll see this has actually had some significant effect. These are very, broad, rough numbers. But if you just look at imported intermediate goods as a share of China's GDP, you see they've declined every year between 2015 and 2024, from a little over 8% to under 6%, which means that China's industry, even though it's almost as big a share of GDP as it always has been, it has a bigger surplus than ever before, and it's less dependent on imported intermediates than ever before. And in some sense, the quote unquote true numbers would be even bigger than this, because China has imported a lot of semiconductors, which are intermediates, right, for stockpiling and other kind of precautionary use. So we can see a big and complex channel through which China's science and technology policy is affecting the economy. Last point, a similarly big picture thing. If we look at one set of areas where science, but especially engineering and especially practical engineering, are having a huge impact, it's the complex of solar panels, batteries, electrolyzers for hydrogen economy, electric vehicles. These are all areas where we know China's made remarkable progress. What I think people have not quite absorbed yet is the fact that progress in each of these areas is ongoing, so that costs have continued to fall and that they're complementary. So that China is on the verge of a cost competitive set of green industry technological advances that are going to have very, very substantial implications. Lots more that could be said, but I better shut up. I've already gone over time, so sorry.
Thank you very much, Barry. Over to you, Jeff.
Hello, all. Thanks for having me here today. One of the terrible things about going after so many brilliant people is that everything has already been said. So I will just refer to a few different concepts. So I work at RAND, where I run the Center for Technology and Security Policy, where our mission is tech competition and tech risks. So that's beat China and don't die. And so we have a very national security focus on things. Additionally, I moonlight at the National Science Foundation, where I run a program on R&D investment effectiveness and also technology forecasting. So with these two different lines of effort, I've had the pleasure of working on two different ways in which U.S. government either does or can think about science and technology data and evidence. And so these two different kinds of moves that USG can do, or any government can do, are two different buckets. One is more system engineering-ish, but still looking ahead. And the other is far more research, which is definitely looking ahead. And this one, we are actually able to do much better than we think we can, though still imperfectly, and we can and should do it more. And this one, we think we're able to do way better than we actually can. And also we should be endeavoring to do it much better. So in the first bucket, a example of the sort of systems engineering style work that US government can do involves things such as export controls. During my time in government, previously at the National Security Council and both now at RAND, I've either been on point for or led teams that were responsible for the original export controls on AI-specific chips, and then relatedly the machines that make those chips, including both the original set of chip controls, the revisions in 2023, and other actions that are sort of been in the mix as of late. So the correct thing for the US to do here with regards to this technological competition of trying to make money by selling the technologies of the future to China and elsewhere, but also retaining control over its effects and making sure that competitors or adversaries do not have capabilities that we do not wish them to have. This is all dependent upon very technical facts. So in the case of AI chips, this was all done because of the concern about frontier AI, which was a bit prescient before ChatGPT, and then after ChatGPT, everyone sort of understands what's going on. And critically, not all chips are equally useful for either training a frontier AI or deploying a frontier AI. And those two moves are themselves technically different. And so setting the sort of thresholds, the technical parameters of what chips should flow and what should not, require understanding in depth these two different things that the chips can do, both now and in the future. It requires understanding both what the tech is doing today at the level of the chips or the level of the AIs, and then how both of those are changing over time, either with simple trend extrapolation or making some technical bets as to how those technologies can change or at least may change. And indeed, we see various instances here where USG was screwed up or was less good than it could have been. I was personally responsible for one of the first rounds where the first chip controls parameters were placed incorrectly. And this was because it was basically I and another guy in a secure facility, and we knew we didn't have the all of the relevant technical knowledge. And we went to everybody who had top secret clearance who worked on high performance computing, but they weren't people who worked on frontier AI. And so those chip controls had the wrong parameters. And as soon as the controls came out, we were able to then go to all the unclear people and say, okay, where should this actually be set at? And we quickly realized the parameters were in the wrong spot. And it took government on the order of a year to correct that, during which time a lot of ships flowed to China that the US strategy had already sort of been against going to China, but such as it was. So an element of how the US should be making decisions about where to set these thresholds is in part upon what China already has, and both what it can make indigenously or what it's already imported. And there have been multiple times where US government has come to, say, RAND or other sort of think tanks saying, how many of these fancy NVIDIA chips have gone to China? And we say, why are you asking us? Why aren't you asking NVIDIA? And they say, well, they may not answer their questions. Well, you have total authorities, Defense Production Act, Title VII, authorities to obtain information. You have subpoena power. You can have them tell you. But this is just illustrative of how USG often has the ability to go access relevant data to make a very technically informed plan, and does not realize that it even has the means to do so in terms of authorities or a bureaucracy set up to do so. So all of this I sort of put in the systems engineering bucket, where we are in fact able to get into fairly precise technical detail as to what technologies are doing or will be doing over the next few years, and be making plans and take actions that make use of those technical facts. It doesn't mean we always get things right, as I illustrated. There are ways in which we can get things wrong. But we are in fact able to do it a lot better than is often appreciated. And it is sort of assumed that government is incapable of getting into all these technical particulars in order to take tactical moves that are very well informed. It takes work, it takes person power, or maybe AI power. If we replace the analytic stack of the humans with more AI systems, that's the thing we're endeavoring to do more at RAND, but it is in fact possible. I'll then put a completely separate category, which is what we often do for research investments. So I think we saw some of the previous speakers say things that are examples of a thing I have seen so often in government, which is when considering how to do research investment, we will consider an array of topics that we care about: AI, biotech, electric vehicles, whatever. And the person who is responsible for the bucket of money will have these different topics in front of them. And the default thing they will do is they'll try to have equal-ish amount of money in each of those things. And then I say, what if I had divided one of the topics into two, right? If I had taken, say, biotech, and I had made it, medicine and biomanufacturing, would you have then put twice as much into this single bucket of biotech because I've now made it represented twice? Well, in fact, people do this often, that you can game out how the decision makers will choose to allocate their money because they want it to be proportional. But it's not always proportional to just the existence of the topics. They are sometimes more about just what's in the news right now. AI is very hot and sexy right now, so everybody wants to put things in AI, right? But in neither of these instances is there anything like a predictive causal model asserting if we put more money into this topic, if we put X dollars into this topic, we are anticipating getting Y more capabilities out. There's very infrequently that we say, all right, $10 more million that Congress has appropriated means that our lithium ion batteries that go in electric vehicles are going to increase by 2%. Nobody ever says that. And you could have a different number for different technologies. It could be that this sort of return on investment would be different across different technologies. And if you knew that, then that would be the basis for making a portfolio, right? You could say, here are the capabilities you have. These are the capabilities that the US people need. And then we have this much budget, and we're going to invest into these different topics in order to be hitting these different capability thresholds that we need. My point here is that we do not realize that we never do this, that in fact we have very little understanding of what the money into capabilities out is. So this is an area where in fact we are largely flying in the dark and could really use some more headlights. All right, that's it for my time. I'll give it to the next person.
Thank you, Jeff. Suzanne.
Sure. So you've heard a lot of information from a lot of different perspectives, and I think we can all probably say that everyone in this room has a different definition of what winning means here, which I think is part of a problem. But to help you understand perhaps my perspective, my day job, I'm an intellectual property consultant. I've spent 30 years teaching companies and universities how to make money off of their intellectual property or to get value out of that, specifically for companies, how to move their stock price. Companies can be quite sophisticated in how they do that. They're, 5% of companies actually use intellectual property and intangibles to change the nature or direction of their company or industry. Very sophisticated. Probably about 15 years ago, I began to notice there were some issues with China. And when I was there on a project around trying to determine if the Chinese government was going to allow NPEs into their markets, I was interviewing legal scholars, judges, and both Western and Eastern attorneys. And the Western and Eastern attorneys started to tell me that the government was asking them to do illegal things with their companies, which begged the question of why? Why would they be doing that? And what was interesting is A, I wasn't asking them these questions. And two, they were in very different industries. And three, why were they telling me, right? Like they were telling me because they felt obligated to tell somebody, but they didn't, there's only so much you can do. Anyways, the question began to bother me, and it took me a long time to figure out that there was a game afoot. With my colleagues, Jean Sajadolski next to me, who you're going to hear from a little bit later, and Bo Hayden, we ended up releasing a paper titled Innovation Warfare in 2020. And the basis of that paper says that the Chinese government has been trying to destabilize the United States economically using the intellectual property system in both legal and illegal ways. And we laid out in the paper the rationale for that. So why am I telling you that? I'm telling you that because I'm not sure that what the US is trying to achieve and what China is trying to achieve are actually the same thing. So there are aspects where they overlap and there are aspects where they're different. So I think we have to look a little bit deeper. So one of the things that we called out in the paper was that pre-1960, about 75% of R&D in the United States was funded by the government. 25% was from the private sector. Today, we are approximately flipped. What does that mean? That means that most of the technologies developed that are going into our have military applications are dual use technologies, and they're being created by private enterprise. Private enterprise in the United States is beholden to shareholders, not to the US government. So they have no governance structure that says we want to take the nation as a stakeholder. We don't have that. So while the US government has the authority to be in charge of this, and specifically the DoD has all the authorities they need to be in charge of national security and economic security, they don't have the authority to go tell Google and OpenAI and et cetera to do what they want them to do. They're beholden to shareholders, which means that we have a profit motive that is different than we have in China, right? So again, and then layer on top of that politicians who have an opinion about all of this that are maybe independent from perhaps what the DoD is thinking, and you kind of have a cluster, right? So, you know, last week I spent all week in Washington, D.C. talking to a number of lawmakers about these topics, and, you know, I have a few things that I would say. One, for those of you who are an IP attorney, an inventor, or a corporation, please start writing congressmen, particularly from the IP and the Senate House Subcommittee on IP, Senate Select Committee, and Howard Lutnick to do not take people away from the Patent Office, right? That's a fee-funded agency. It is not funded by the federal government. And we need all of that. As you can hear today, patent data is a good sensor for many aspects of this thing. Two, that as we just heard previously, there's not a lot of cohesion in the government, and particularly at the political level, around what to do about this. There's a lot of angst about it, and there's not a lot of understanding. And the content expertise lies across a number of different government agencies. And so that's also very helpful because there are people who understand this very well. They're not always coordinated in a way that perhaps we would want. So I think there's some room for improvement there. And then just going back to DeepSeek for a second. Again, when we talk about what does winning look like, I got some information today that, you know, says it didn't take 6 million to create that. It actually took $1 billion. Two, the hedge fund that created that technology also shorted NVIDIA stock. So where did they make their money in this play? They made it on the short. They didn't have to make it on opening it up. Three, if you're the Chinese government and you think that TikTok might be banned, and TikTok is a big sucking sound of data going from the US to China, why wouldn't you open a second source of sucking sound of data, which is DeepSeek? Three or four, I got a note from Perplexity today saying that they've embedded DeepSeek into their product, and they're now offering that to all their clients, hence larger sucking sound going to China. These are all complex problems, right? And they're all different ways of which these things are being manipulated. And realistically, we have this profit motive from the United States, which is problematic, right? Because our companies are in charge. So against all of that backdrop, I want to share with you something that my colleagues at Berkeley and I presented to the Select Committee last year around open source in semiconductors. But I think this concept of strategic openness is one we should consider here, because it is impossible. I think what you're hearing generally around all of the experts in the room, it is impossible to stop China from getting access to the technology they need. It is just not happening, right? Like, let's even look at the Russia-Ukraine war, pick up a drone, open it up, it's full of US parts all on the ban list. That didn't seem to work very well, right? So again, it's just not possible. What is possible? So next slide, please. So next slide, actually. So when we talk about open innovation, right, I want to keep focused on two things. One is on who's developing it, right? And the other is on who's distributing it, who can have access to it. Next slide, please. So when you look at that, I want to pick a couple of different technology areas to show the level of openness or closed along these two axes, right? So in the top right corner, we have Linux, right, which is open source. Obviously, it's going to be the most open of everything. You know, you have to the left, LTE, which is a communication standard. So again, the development of it was very open, but the application of it is quite closed, right? In the bottom, the most closed is Apple, right? They take very tight control of all of that. MySQL is in the middle, Bluetooth is along the distribution and pretty open, and the development of it is pretty close. So again, these companies are making choices about the technology development and distribution based on what they feel is their own competitive advantage and what objectives they're trying to achieve. Next slide. So let's just talk a little bit about encryption, because the US government has actually tried these things both successfully and unsuccessfully in the past. So let's talk about it. So back in the 1990s, we wanted to do some encryption. And so the government wanted to achieve two different things, right? They wanted to have a backdoor for law enforcement around encryption technology, but they also wanted to make sure that, you know, your medical records and your banking records were secure, that those couldn't be tampered with. So they decided that they were going to do this Clipper thing, and they were going to create all of this technology themselves and then try to distribute it and have people pick it up. Well, shock, nobody picked it up, because nobody felt like, well, they didn't know what it was. They didn't feel that it was what was in their interests. And so it was sort of a big flop. Okay. So then in, you know, the early 2000s, NIST decided to take a different approach, and they actually opened up a competition, an encryption competition all around the world, and had everyone participate. And they ended up picking, you know, something from Belgium as the winner of this technology. And the reason, and it was adopted all around the world. And it was adopted for two reasons. One, first off, that NIST got to see what everyone was doing, right? Because you got everyone participating in trying to pitch their ideas into this and how it was going to work. And then two, you got a lot of adoption of people using this technology because they were able to see what was happening and how it was being created. That's the difference between an open and a closed system, right? So you can see a little bit about the benefits of that. Next slide. So when we keep going, so what we did in talking with the select committee, again, we were there to be talking about open source and semiconductors. So we talked a little bit about, well, okay, in semiconductors, you have sort of Intel on one side, which is closed, right? They're very tightly holding that. ARM is perhaps on the distribution end in the middle. I don't know why it's not working, if there's any more builds that you have in there. Yeah. So then we said, okay, now let's look at an example with AI, right? So again, you have OpenAI on the closed close side, and the NIST, if we take that NIST example up in the top right, or Apple, and then you have Meta in the middle, right? And risk, can't see what that is actually. RISC-V, right, is sort of the middle point. Companies are making decisions on how they want to monetize and control this technology for their own shareholder purposes. It doesn't mean that it's wrong. It's just that they're different, and there are cost considerations with that, right? So in a closed system, if you look at OpenAI and Google and others, it's really expensive. It takes a lot of money, and that's what they've been doing in raising money. Meta took a different approach, right? They didn't need to monetize the technology because they're monetizing ads. So where are you going to make your money? Right? And what are you trying to do if you want to get something quickly adopted and get people using it to drive your other source of value? Then maybe open is a better way to go, right? But again, these are business and competition issues that companies are very well versed in. Next slide. So again, when we just think about these things, like what does winning look like? I think we have to take these considerations into account, right? I don't think that Google, the DoD, as much as they would love to tell Google what to do, doesn't get to do that, right? I mean, they can ask nicely and Google can say yes or no, but shareholders ultimately are the ones doing that. So going back to this issue today, A, we have to define the right question on what winning looks like. B, we have to define we have to help with our companies, get them aligned with what winning looks like from a national security standpoint. And that has to all line up as well with their individual profitability motives. And then I think we have to think about what data do we need to do that? Because those are, I'm hearing lots and lots of good ideas and they're all from very different perspectives. And we have to then align our government to be able to get the data, get the information, make better decisions around all of these things happening at the same time. And right now we're very far from that.
Thank you, Suzanne. I know we have an extraordinary group of people here in the room, but also online, and we're going to turn to Q&A now. To prime the pump, and I encourage all of you to raise your hands if you're in the virtual audience or here in the room. To prime the pump, we've been talking about innovation and technology by and large as a flat space. But I want to ask if there's something distinctive about particular fields like AI that might be different for other technologies. For example, some may yield to export controls better than others. Some are mostly about flows of talent and intangible knowledge, like algorithms that are harder to control. And this is relevant to, say, quantum as well as AI. And so the question is, how do we develop sufficiently flexible rubrics to apply to the right technologies to understand what the appropriate tools and data would be to manage these in a more sensible way? And I think Suzanne's point is vital here in the argument that the funding of technology and innovation has flipped in the last 50 or 60 years so that the private sector is driving the lion's share of it, because it seems there are questions about how do we promote innovation without socializing the risk by private sector actors who may not necessarily be acting in the public interest, but have fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders. So that's a second question. And then a third question is, here we are talking largely in terms of bilateral competition, US-China. The world's a really big place. Yes, US-China might be the relevant metric today, but there are also other states that are relevant. There are non-state actors that are relevant. There are non-state actors who, with access to particular open source technologies, could use them in ways that would be deeply prejudicial to international peace and security. Imagine terrorist organizations, which can use off-the-shelf open source technologies to engineer better chemical weapons. So I just put that out there, like, how do we make this problem tractable? Because it has gotten away from us. And I invite the speakers to weigh in. Don't all rush to the mic.
Well, I mean, I think this illustrates the problem. There's not an answer yet, right? So I think that, I guess I would say if I had a magic wand, I would like there to be a nexus in the government, some combination of the DoD, Commerce, and the US Patent Office actually studying this and putting this all together along with the National Security Council, right? So I think we need a nexus of people who are in charge of the decisions, who are identifying as these things crop up in the government, making sure that they're understood broadly, right? Because again, anywhere you are in the government, pick your agency, you see an issue and it arises in whatever your view of the world is. If you're a treasury, it's a treasury problem. If you're in the DoD, it's a DoD problem. If you're in, perhaps in commerce, it's an industrial policy problem. It might involve all of those groups, but again, you're only tasked to answer the question for your agency, not necessarily to do the work of bringing them all together. So if we could find a way to get a group who could do that, I think that would be very helpful.
I want to turn to the online audience with questions, but I don't see your names on the screen, so it's very hard for me to call on you and very awkward to do it descriptively, but I'm going to do that.
James is the first one, and then Jeanette and Francesca. So James, Jeanette, Francesca. That's the order on the screen. You go ahead and call on whoever you want to start.
Perfect.
on.
Let's go with that. Thank you, Margaret. James.
Oh, thank you. I want to ask a quick question to Susan. That is, since DeepSeek uses the data it got from OpenAI and turn around to compete against OpenAI, do you think in the future that the open system should impose some kind of a KYC system before the data is being shared?
So I think there's a lot of things embedded in that question. So let me try and break them apart. So first, you're assuming that they had trade secret misappropriation, which is what OpenAI is claiming. So if that's true, intellectual property is a remedy for this issue. That is unlawful. Let's start with that. If in fact it wasn't that, and it was a lawful use of their platform, then we're just talking about the ability to rip apart and use some of the base components for their piece. Second thing is, open source, as was mentioned earlier, actually involves license agreements and has requirements that go along with that. Even though something is open, doesn't mean it's open source. So I don't know whether or not DeepSeek used an open source agreement, but there are expectations and behaviors that go along with that. And so I would be curious if that were true and they did use that agreement, are they in compliance with the agreement? If it's just open, which just means free, then you have a question of, well, okay, was it espionage or not? I don't know. These are all questions that need to be figured out. And that's why you're seeing this flurry of information.
Do our other panelists wish to weigh in on that question? All right, Jeanette, over to you.
Thanks so much. So I wanted to go back to Suzanne's excellent suggestion of better coordination, particularly in the government. I think that already exists, as does some goodly bit, frankly, of interaction with industry, including at the leading edge. The Commerce Department, of course, runs a number of technical advisory committees, which is where a lot of the input from industry comes into play, as well as hiring consultants, which they did for some of the recent rulemaking that you saw come out. But with regard to the interagency piece, that has been longstanding, both through the export control licensing regimes, which go through a interagency review process, the entity list designations, a different interagency group, but again, an interagency and iterative process. And then, of course, escalation to the policy level, the political appointee level for things that are perhaps a little bit more difficult to resolve at first blush. I like the idea of trying to involve PTO in that discussion. I think the challenge becomes a little bit that once you've made that patent filing and patent has been granted, of course, then it's already in the public domain. So there's really nothing to export control, so to speak, under the regulations. I think the caution that I have when we say, well, we got to figure out what should or should not be controlled. We talk about technology as if it's very dynamic, which of course it is. But so too are the regulations. Just within the last 6-7 weeks, there's been at least as many such regulations coming out, and they're coming out from different parts of government, whether it's commerce, different parts of commerce, the State Department, Department of Energy, now the Justice Department, Treasury, and others. And I think there's more movement that we have to think about. If you're at the point where you are imposing an export control, in a sense, you've already lost from a technology innovation standpoint, because you're chasing after something, right? You're running after something to say, wait, we got to stop this from getting into a bad actor's hands or foreign adversary hands. Meanwhile, export controls as a body of knowledge, as a mechanism, does continue to evolve. Look at all the foreign direct product rules. And it evolves in ways that are not necessarily symmetric. For example, we have moved from list-based controls. We're controlling a thing, right? To parameter controls and capability controls, to and user controls. And now we're swinging backwards to really hone in on destination controls. So I think it's worth watching that space, and that may help us try to figure out what is a more logical point in which to interject from this perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can just respond to that briefly. Again, I'll go back to the innovation warfare paper where we called out something called future-oriented technology analysis, which is a predictive technology using patent and non-patent data. So again, I was an advisor to the USPTO for 3 years. And what I would say is that we aren't giving all of the data that would help make better decisions in the government to all of that, right? The USPTO doesn't view this as their job. This is
Right.
not their job to provide data to that is very useful. We've all determined patent data is very useful. It is not the end all be all, but it is helpful, right?
Mhm.
So you have an agency who has a lot of data that's not giving it to the people who are making the decisions. So perhaps, even though that data might be public, it's still very, very helpful because patents come well before technologies and products and markets. So as an example, we all know about the problem with cutting sea cables, right? With adversarial nations doing that. There was a patent on that. We know exactly how they're doing it. It happened many years ago. It's not a secret. So would that be useful to know? Probably. That patent was like 10 years ago. We are getting signals about a lot of this stuff. So I think while there are many good things going on in the government, if we could have better data that is more predictive of behavior to get things on the ITAR or control list faster, sooner, that would be helpful. Companies want that too. Nobody wants to spend a lot of money developing a technology and then right before you're about to sell it, find out, whoops, half the world is gone. Can't sell it there. That's, from a company perspective, that's frustrating. From the government perspective, if they had that data earlier, that might be useful to all of us, right? So these are just, I agree with you, and I'm saying we can do better.
Yeah,
Without a doubt, we can do better. Absolutely. I've been on both sides, and I fully agree.
Yeah, thank you, Jeanette, and thank you, Suzanne. It's a great discussion. I just wanted to add my 2 cents for a moment because you have an agency in the PTO that is probably since we lack a civil technology agency, it's probably the best you can get since we basically have 10,000 STEM trained examiners that are not being put to any purpose other than examining patents. So if you were optimizing government efficiency, like the president is attempting to do, you might say, well, gee, we ought to use this talent for other purposes, particularly assessing risks, particularly in an era of civil military fusion. This is a different time from 20 years ago, and the amount of time between when you have a civil technology and a military technology, perhaps in part because it's being developed privately, has shrunk. That is well beyond the capacity, I think, of the people at BIS. I don't know how many engineers are there. God bless them. And I think it's even beyond the capacity of PTO because they're not looking at that. So really, if you were brainstorming about an ideal world, I think these points are exactly correct because we really need to integrate the government to come up with more thoughtful approaches. And God knows, even when I was in the PTO, I would get asked questions sometimes from some of these agencies, and it was clear they didn't understand what a patent was, or they didn't know how to use that data and apply it, for example, in an export control or CFIUS context.
So BIS does have, like, all licensing officers are in fact trained engineers. And there are other groups within BIS that do things like look at emerging technologies, forward technologies. That is what ECRA was also designed to address, right? Giving that remit to the Commerce Department, but better alignment and better coordination between the two would certainly be welcome. I think I mentioned to you, Mark, in a different context, that Project 2025 actually proposes merging PTO with NIST, which is an interesting concept. But I think you and Suzanne both raise a better point just about the information flow between PTO and BIS. And also just the larger ecosystem, export control ecosystem, which, as Suzanne points out, is not just commerce, it's also State Department under ITAR and the Defense Department elements as well.
Francesca's been very patient. I'm going to impose on her patience just for one moment longer and add a couple points to Mark's and what others have said. Something that I routinely butt up against is not just the question of mission alignment within the various agencies and authorities, but it is that they sit on pockets of really valuable data that they cannot share with each other. For perfectly understandable, good regulatory reasons that were adopted at a particular point in time, sometimes to respond to abuses, but they do impair the ability of people to see the totality of the picture and to action it. And so dealing with those pockets of data and the siloed nature of them, I think is key here too. But over to Francesca.
Sorry, I'm gonna have a question which has nothing to do with regulatory system, and is to Barry, if I may. And I guess it's a question that a lot of China scholars have been battling with for a long time. If we assume that China has been successful in its industrial policy, and I know it's a stretch of an assumption, but let's assume it has been successful, does it mean that industrial policy in large part is the answer to the questions that we're having today? In other words, how much of what China has done is China specific? And how much can we take away? And I know that there are like 4 minutes, and this is probably a paper answer rather than a short one, but let's give it a try.
I would assert that it is not China specific. It is about being at the technological frontier versus behind the technological frontier. When you are far away from the technological frontier, you can, in principle, observe a lot of technical facts between where you are and where the rich people are, and build a game plan to get there. Whereas if you are at the technological frontier, you are going into a different kind of uncertainty, and so and it affects your ability to make plans. And I don't think it's just been China. There's been multiple countries that have made technological bets that were central bases for their great rise in GDP per capita. But it doesn't mean that that same kind of bet still plays out for those who are at the frontier. That is not asserting that industrial policy can't work for those at the frontier. It's just asserting that the evidence from those who are behind does not translate to those who are at the frontier, which will include China now on some topics, right? Just because what it was doing won't necessarily continue to work.
Barry, as the economist in the room, I want to give you the last word on that question.
I couldn't say it better than Jeff just did.
All right, well, thank you. Back over to Mark. Thank you very much for a wonderful panel and discussion.
Thank you. This is where we say bye to our online folks and the people in the room. Lunch is right outside. We have a 7-minute break, and then we'll pick it up. Thank you again to K&L Gates for hosting lunch, and a big thank you to all the speakers in the room. Thank you so much.
Thanks to the fabulous audience. Thank you.
Yes.